A, B, C. Easy, it's 1, 2, 3. Episode 1, 2, 3 of Mr. Men Book Readings. Little Miss Tiny. Oh, and also, excuse the noise in the background. My fan's on. Little Miss Tiny by Roger Hargreaves. Little Miss Tiny was extremely small and not very tall at all. She was so very tiny she didn't live in a house. Do you know where she lived? In a mouse hole in the dining room of Home Farm. She had made the mouse hole quite comfortable, really, and luckily there weren't any mice because the farm canter chased them all away. The trouble was because she was so tiny, nobody knew she lived there. Nobody had noticed her. Not even the farmer and his wife. So there she lived, all alone with nobody to talk to. She was very lonely and sad. Oh dear. One day she was feeling so lonely, she decided to be very brave and go for a walk. Out of her mouse hole she came, and she crept along across the dining room and went through the crack in the door and into the hall. To little Miss Tiny, the hall looked as big as a field, and she scuttled across it to the back door of the farm. Luckily for her, the letterbox was at the bottom of the door, and she squeezed herself through it and onto the doorstep. It was all very exciting. There before her was the farmyard. She went exploring. She came to a door with a gap at the bottom and ducked in underneath. There inside was a pig. A large pig, and if you were as small as little Miss Tiny, a large pig looks very large indeed. Little Miss Tiny looked at the pig, and the pig looked at Miss Tiny. Oink! He grunted and moved closer to inspect this little person who'd entered his sty. Oh my goodness me! Squeaked little Miss Tiny in alarm, and shot at the pig's side as fast as ever her little legs would carry her, which wasn't very fast because her legs were so very little. She ran right around to the back of the pig's sty before she stopped. She leaned against the wall and put her hands over her eyes and tried to get her breath back. Suddenly she heard a noise, a very close noise, a sort of breathing noise, very close indeed. She hardly dared take her hands away from her eyes, but when she did, she wished she hadn't. What do you think it was there, right in front of her, looking at her with green eyes? It was Ginger the farm cat! Poor little Miss Tiny! Ginger grinned, showing his teeth. Help! Shrieked little Miss Tiny at the top of her voice. Oh, somebody please help! The trouble was, the top of little Miss Tiny's voice was not a very loud place. Ginger grinned another grin. Probably doesn't need her. Every day, Mr. Strong went to Home Farm to buy some eggs. He liked eggs, lots of them. That day he was walking home across the farmyard when he heard a very tiny squeak. He stopped. There it was again, round the corner. He looked round the corner and saw Ginger and the poor trapped little Miss Tiny. Shoo! Said Mr. Strong to Ginger, and picked up little Miss Tiny very gently. Hello, he said. Who are you? I'm Miss Tiny. You are, aren't you? Smiled Mr. Strong. Well, if I was as tiny as you, I wouldn't go wandering around large farmyards. But, said Miss Tiny, and she told Mr. Strong about how low she was so lonely she had to come out to find somebody to talk to. Oh dear, said Mr. Strong. Well now, let's see if we can't find you some friends to talk to. And now every week, Mr. Strong collects little Miss Tiny and takes her off to see her friends. 3 weeks ago, he took her to see Mr. Funny, who told her so many jokes she couldn't stop laughing all day. 2 weeks ago, he took her to see Mr. Greedy. He told her his recipe for his favourite meal, but that's much too much. For tiny little Miss Me, she laughed. Mr. Greedy grinned. For you, he said, divide by 100. And last week, Mr. Strong took her to see Mr. Silly, and Mr. Silly showed her how to stand on your head. That's very silly, giggled little Miss Silly. Thank you, replied Mr. Silly modestly. And guess who she met this week? Somebody who's become a special little friend, Mr. Small. I never thought I'd ever meet anybody smaller than myself, laughed little Mr. Small. Little Miss Tiny looked up at him and smiled. You wait till I grow up, she said.